this, I think, is as powerful as it gets, as deep in expertise as it gets on the capital provider side as well as the policymaker side. We were discussing what is it that we need to do to make sure, just like Adrian was speaking earlier, that innovators and policymakers need to now start to develop the road ahead together. This conversation is about finding some of those ways on how that can be done. We're going to break this up in two parts. The first one, we're going to talk a little bit about crypto. And then we will immediately jump into artificial intelligence because that's the hot topic of the day. Let's start with our investors, our capital providers. So, Melissa, maybe I can start with you. Of course, they say that everyone is wiser after the event, and we have about $2 trillion of value lost in crypto over the last few months. Are there any lessons that capital providers or investors at large can draw from this experience of value destruction in such a short period of time?
Well, I'm actually very happy to say we didn't lose any money at Arbor. Okay. And the reason for that is because before I would actually invest our investors' money, I actually very early on bought Bitcoin and Ethereum and realized that the custodial aspects of it were not safe. And actually that if I didn't feel like my own money was safe, I would never put our investor money into it. And I still think you have just tremendous risk as far as the custodial aspects goes and the keys go. But let me just, having been, and we only do financial services globally, and perhaps I probably have a different view. I mean, I do live in Singapore and have been in Asia now for 18 years, which is you can't let an industry get that large and not begin to regulate it, especially when it touches retail money. And I think what happened was that, one, there's been a lot of regulatory arbitrage around the world. I think the U.S. being the largest market couldn't decide whether it was a security or money, and therefore no regulation. And there, you end up getting the disaster we've had with FTX, which is a disaster. And actually, I think around the world, you got to regulate. Regulators needed to step in perhaps a little bit earlier, not kill innovation, but at least put the boundaries in place for good corporate governance and security of individuals' money. And I think lessons learned, and we've seen this repeatedly, by the way. I mean, the Chinese government doing what they did with Ant, when you have 97% of all digital payments that are going through two companies, you do have systemic risk. You got to come back and regulate it. The question with regulators always is, when do you regulate it? Do you regulate it when it's still a very small industry, or do you end up regulating when it's a very large industry? There's no perfect answer, so it's somewhere in between. But I think as an investor, you have to use your own moral compass and your own ideas about what am I doing, what am I investing in, where's the regulation likely to go down the road, and make those decisions for yourself on behalf of your own fund, and of course, being a fiduciary to our investors.
Got it. What would you say, Sigal, to this as an investor?
Well, I think, and I've been on both sides,
yes.
Right? So I'm an investor now, but I also was one of the top regulators in this space when I was at the Undersecretary at the Treasury Department. I think, look, this is a good moment for people to go back, reevaluate their theses. We've always been in crypto and in fintech. We were always very early believers, for example, in Bitcoin for a number of reasons. And you go back and test, does your philosophy, does your thesis that took you down this road, do you still believe in that thesis? Do you still believe that this technology is going to form at least part of the financial infrastructure rails, for example, of the future? It's just, we should always be doing that regardless of whether you have a downturn or upturn. You should always be challenging your assumptions. And so at Ribbit, we've done that like every other venture firm. And at the end of the day, we continue to believe in this thesis. We continue to believe that this is a sector where you have incredible talent, computer scientists, software developers, entrepreneurs, who are really looking to build that next layer of the internet of value. And it just makes you, decide, are you going to buckle down or are you going to continue? But we're also long-term investors. We're not, looking at the ups and downs of any particular token in that way. On the regulation point, which I think is a very important one, we actually did, when I was at the Treasury Department, we actually did regulate crypto. I oversaw FinCEN and OFAC and an intelligence agency and a policy shop that had the lead globally for FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. And FinCEN had regulated crypto since 2013. Was the first, I think, in the world to do so, and was regulating it for AML purposes. I came in 2017, and the thing that I noticed was that there were only 3 countries in the world that were regulating crypto in the same way that we were from an AML perspective. It was the US, Japan, and Australia. And our view was we were agnostic about any particular technology. We just wanted to make sure that when bad things happened, or bad actors tried to use it to manipulate, and do money laundering, et cetera, we could catch and disrupt those bad actors. And of course, when you don't have other countries in the world who are regulating it that way, that's what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of arbitrage. So at least on the anti-money laundering side, we made a big push to encourage countries all over the world to do the same thing. And of course, now we're seeing the EU, for example, really take a lead in that respect. And I think all of that is going to continue to allow us to be more and more sophisticated in disrupting the bad actors. Now we just want regulators in the securities, commodities space to do the same thing. Take the leadership, again, to allow the innovation to grow.
We were at a Capital Meets Policy Dialogue just last week in Africa, where MD Ravi Menon of the Monetary Authority of Singapore was asked the same question. And he actually echoed the same thing as both of you have articulated, that policy comes after capital's gone in and there's some early adoption. But he said it's not a science, it's not an art. Policy should be behind, but not too far behind. Now, it's very difficult to define how far is too far. And at the Capital Meets Policy Dialogue in Singapore last year, one of the comments made by Sheila Bair, who's former US FDIC chair, was together with the Director General of the National Bank of Cambodia, that for policymakers, if you do or you don't, you're damned either ways. It's too early is too early, too late is too late, too much is too much, and too little is too little. So let's ask our policymakers who have this massive problem of, Adrian earlier said that we're now looking to work together with innovators to develop the future. What are lessons learned, in your opinion, from an EU perspective on the collapse of crypto and the value destruction that happened?
It's not the collapse, right?
Okay. So what word would you use?
Well, you're in a conference with a lot of incredible innovators, right? So yes, a lot of value went down, but that happened with the .com bubble. You need to have a lot of different testing of different kinds of products to get to a Google. So that's all. I would say it's not a collapse. There's still great innovators who are building and developing. Sorry.
Thank you for that. Okay, Axel.
Yes, so thank you. As a legislator, of course, it's always hard to find the correct timing for this, because at first you have a kind of a development, what you probably do not understand. Then all of a sudden you see some consequences out of it, what you don't like. And then you're thinking about, and you're starting to think about how to regulate these. So from my point of view, I would say what we have done with social media, when we did not know what is a platform and what is the internet about, so at the beginning of this century, we let this go, and all of a sudden you see it's hard to go back to a certain point. So to get rid of illegal content and so on from the platform. So This is why I think a democratic legislator with these fragmented political starting points, they have to act earlier. And so this is what we are trying now in the AI Act, to give a kind of a delegated power to the Commission and saying, please catch up with the developments. And this is what we also have done in this called AIDA report, in saying we need a more flexible legislator, and let's say in a 3-month time to have a legitimate, democratic founded decision on something, probably more in guidelines, not in detailed regulation. Let this grow, but also frame it. And this is, I think we should work together. And if I'm seeing now the developments in the ChatGPT or generative AI elements, I would say we also should sit together with these developers, because they are very enthusiastic in developing. And we are saying, oh, this is what we don't like, and here are some points of these. And that's why I think we need to sit together and say what is technical feasible still, and how we can frame this in a better way. But this is sometimes not happening, and that's why then we are overreacting on some elements, and then it comes to this point where you would say, oh, this is now overregulated.
Yeah.
We've done too much.
Indeed. Policymakers are accused of not putting controls and guardrails on social media in time. And it's gone to what it's become now. Mm-hmm. And will AI go that way? We don't know yet. If I may ask Karmela, and I'm going to read a quote from a guy called Mark Andreessen. He wrote an essay just a few days ago, and I quoted him earlier as well. He says that AI is quite possibly the most important and best thing our civilization has ever created, certainly on par with electricity and microchips. And then he goes on to say that big AI companies should be given freedom, open source should happen. Do you agree as a policymaker, and how do you counter that perspective that's coming from a bellwether investor globally?
I think there are two perspectives from a central bank's view, and the one is a systemic view, like how do we anticipate potential risk to financial stability? And then the other one is a more micro perspective as a supervisor. What do we need to change in the way we do supervision? What is the future of supervision? What are the assets we are supervising? How do we supervise algorithms in the best possible way without, let's say, cutting them down and still giving the needed guidelines and the needed framework Axel just mentioned? And the thing we saw, or we still see, with how to deal with crypto and now how to deal with AI is that technology is moving so fast, and we need to have, let's say, flexible adjustments to this kind of fast tempo we are seeing. Because if we now agree on a regulation and it takes a year to establish it, it won't fit anymore the purpose in the future. So I think we will have a general shift to more guideline approach and to a more interactive approach, because we cannot do it as policymakers, as central banks, or the legislation without the market participants. So it needs more collaboration, and it needs more early on conversations and joint explorations to also get a better understanding of both sides. Because what we realized as a central bank when we started our startup collaboration was it was super difficult for us to explain what is the role of a central bank in such a process, and vice versa. So it's also about learning from all of the sides. It's a huge educational, in the end, shift and change.
So is the regulator then becoming also a competitor for limited talent? The capital providers are looking for best talent in their companies that they're investing in. Now you've got policymakers who say, look, we don't understand the domain, and how we're going to understand it is we're going to bring the talent that already is short supply into us. And, are you going to be able to pay as much as maybe private sector can? I mean, is that a problem? Is that an opportunity?
It's both. It is a problem and an opportunity. Sure, we cannot pay the wages the private sector is paying.
Yeah.
But joining the public service, joining a central bank or whatever public institution is super meaningful. And you can be part of creating guidelines and rules.
Adrian just said, come and join the DFS because that's what we are doing. What would you say, Melissa, to Mark Andreessen saying everything should be free and open and there should be, at least for now, maybe not too much control on it?
Well, I think he is right about, let's say, OpenAI, ChatGPT-4, which is the power behind it is just, it's just very much like the internet or the development of the semiconductor industry very early on. I did read the regulation in the EU and I thought, wow, it's kind of restrictive. It has, so I think you have to look at the positives. I mean, if you think about the advancements we can make in healthcare, right? And the advancements we can make in other aspects, meaning maybe, education as a good example. There's so many positives about generative AI and where the world can go on a positive front. On the negative front, which I think you just highlighted, which is fraudsters are going to get a lot smarter, right? This idea of ghosting and phishing and the sophistication. I mean, we've already seen so many sophisticated cyber attacks and fraud attacks. And just think about now if you're a regulator at a central bank and you got to go deal with, highly, highly sophisticated attacks using generative AI, which, by the way, if you put in how does ChatGPT-4 help fraudsters, it comes back and it says, of course, we do not. So I actually play around with it quite a bit to see where it would go. But I think there's a balance, right? There's the part where you have to protect social good and the interest of the public from, degenerative or very malicious acts and intent. But the flip side of it, we would absolutely not want to limit the benefits of where we can go in healthcare services to solve, diseases or actually have companies be able to, advance themselves a lot faster by limiting, the use of generative AI.
Sigal, again, you've been on both sides. If we were to look at, there is a lot of conversation going around on AI should be approved before it is released, quite like drugs are, quite like medicine is. Is that a way out?
No, because approved by whom? Number one, do people have the talent, expertise, understanding? I think there are a lot of people who'll be motivated to go to the government with this expertise for a particular period of time, but only if they feel like they are actually a material part of the conversation. Because sometimes you can attract amazing engineers and then they get caught up in the bureaucracy of the government and they say, forget it. We don't want to have anything to do with this. But the different point is the innovators are going to innovate regardless of what the government does or says. So I think it's a little bit naive to say, you can't do anything unless we give you the stamp of approval, because that's just going to incentivize people to go outside the box and to go to jurisdictions where there's a lot more freedom. So we just have to accept this is happening. It's happening regardless of what policymakers say or do. The best thing to do is, I think, what you see, for example, Singapore just released a paper where they came together with the private sector. They developed the guidelines hand in hand, and they're continuing to have those kinds of very constructive conversations. We don't always do that well in the United States, by the way. In fact, it tends to be not when I was undersecretary, but it tends to be an us versus them mentality often. And that's going to result in us getting it drastically wrong. I think, again, you have to bring the two together. But you can't say don't do anything. It's just not it's impossible. It's not going to work.
Axel, if I may, I was talking to a very senior banker, global bank, American, runs AI globally for the bank. And I said, what has changed for you after GPTs come in? And what's the conversation in the bank? So this is, there's no conversation. We will wait for the regulations to come because the cost of being negatively affected by a regulation because we attempted something very innovative with GPT or generative AI is far too much, far too difficult. So when these big banks delay doing innovations, innovators are bringing solutions to them. It sort of causes a negative domino, which is not friendly to innovation because the big boys are holding back because policy is not clear. Is there a way out of this?
So I would hope so. So far, our proceedings are too ponderous. That's why. So if we would like to regulate now generative AI, then we probably need in Europe 4 years, 5 years, and then we don't know if this is still existing when we are ending this. So that's why we need to come to kind of a better approach also in our democratic proceedings. I always would give the advice in please do not stop, especially in digital developments, in investing and so on. Of course, there's always a risk when the regulator is overburdening everything or over-regulating everything. I know, but if you have a wonderful idea, just do it. So it's a little bit strange, probably, as a center-right politician to say, oh, more anarchy, more revolution is necessary. But in the digital world, as long as we are not catching up with the developments and as long as we are not in the front seat of regulating everything and we're waiting too long, so I would say do, otherwise we'll probably have a lot of competitors all around the world. They are doing these, and if you're not doing these, you will have a kind of a disadvantage.
Sorry.
No, this is where I would say it's necessary also to know the needs of the one who would like to invest, who would like to develop. And I can understand the developers in saying, oh, I have a wonderful idea and I'm developing and without no borders and so on. But at the end, we should sit together and saying, so these are our values. This is what you should have in mind. And of course, once we are starting with a detailed regulation, then it's becoming worse. Because then we are more consumer protection orientated and to try to mitigate every risk everywhere. So therefore, it would be better if you are starting, try to come to the regulator and try to find out what our point might be. A balanced situation would be the best way forward. But herefore, we need, of course, a kind of a very logic approach in a way. It's sometimes hard with politicians.
Okay. You want to make a comment on this, Karmela?
Yes, because I also see two kind of trends. And one is before we had a problem and then we were searching for the technology to meet the problem. And now sometimes when talking to market participants, I have the feeling that, oh yeah, we see all the different kind of technologies in front of us. We actually do not know which problem to solve with it sometimes. So it's also easy to point out to the regulator and say, you need to do some regulation. When I sometimes think maybe you could think of how this technology can serve you the best possible way. And maybe sometimes some technologies cannot. And this is also a conversation that needs to take place more than it takes now. And still, I would say we need to get on the one hand, companies must take risks, and we need to stay there and have an early stage conversation on what we see are, let's say, things that needs to be addressed directly. Is it data quality? I don't know, hallucination of AI models, whatsoever. So it's a responsibility on both sides.
Yep. So I would really recommend, as a developer or whatever, be your own legislator. Then you might come to kind of an aspect where the real legislator don't have to come in because there is no problem. That's why I would always consider in saying, please have the mindset of a legislator and try to create an environment where no problems are occurring.
Yeah, I mean, I get reminded of my little son was little, and I would tell him, you're not watching anything in your room because it's time to sleep. And I would think he would do it, but he would actually be watching it inside his blanket. So there will never be, I think, the right way to do this. Melissa, I have a question for you. There is a lot of conversation now that existing investments of venture capitalists in many of their companies could be at risk as a result of what generative AI is capable of doing. And many of these portfolio companies are being valued down. Is that really happening? Is that a risk? And has generative AI become a counter to its own investment case?
Well, I think we looked across our own portfolio, and we have 4 companies that said, oh, this is better. We're ripping out at least our language models, and we're inserting ChatGPT 4. And actually, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's fluent in Arabic, Chinese, it's amazing technology. So in our case, it's not about disrupting our portfolio. It's about our own CEOs saying, hey, this is better than what the code we wrote, and we're going to incorporate it in the product versus being disruptive to the existing companies that we've invested in.
And so is that making finding the real value in companies going forward more difficult? Or is the conversation at the investment committee saying, but this can be done by ChatGPT, and why would we look at this company? And has the universe of potential investments shrunk as a result?
No, I mean, if things can be done by ChatGPT 4, they were pretty low level. I think it's the layer on top of ChatGPT that is very interesting. I mean, what you're going to end up seeing is verticalization by industry. I mean, if you use ChatGPT and you'll say, it's pretty generic on a lot of subject matters. Let's take fraud as an example. It's just an investment area. We love to invest against fraud, right? But it's pretty generic. And I think what you'll end up seeing is that you'll have healthcare verticals that are using ChatGPT. It'll be part of a company's solution, but not ultimately, providing a competitor maybe to OpenAI or what Google is doing. But let me give you an example of, we've been using generative AI in our portfolio for quite some time. We have a company that's automated debt collection in the US, and there are no dialers. And when you receive a message on the other end, through a text or by email, it's already been a persona. And what it has been doing is trying different personas to see how that person connects so that you can make that connection. It's generative. So this concept of generative AI is absolutely not new. It just, now you have a platform where you don't necessarily have to develop the algorithms yourself. You can layer on top of what other things are doing. But I think what we'll also see is closed loop AI, generative AI within a company. I mean, if you're a big insurance company, you would really like to understand your data a lot better than you do today. You can use it in a closed loop setting, so it's not going out back to the general internet. And I think what we're going to see is it's a next generation of a tool that's incorporated in end solutions, where the technology is either better or more efficient than actually what we see today.
Okay, got it. I would request the audience to keep a question or two ready. We're going to have time for that. But Sigal, if I were to ask you the same question, that the investment committee now at Rivet, for example, what are you talking? What's the conversation at the table around the power of or the risk of GPT taking over the company that you're looking to invest in?
I think we talk to our companies a lot about this too, and we are testing out and looking at what they're experimenting with. I think any company today that's not taking this innovation seriously is going to get left behind. I mean, that's what's so exciting about being at a venture capital firm or an investment firm that's focused on financial technology disruption, right? We're always looking to see how new innovations can be incorporated into existing solutions. And it's the people who are not thinking that way who I think will get left behind. I actually found what you said before about a banker saying we're just waiting for our regulators before we use this to be totally fascinating and terrific for investment firms because if in financial services, because if a bank is waiting for their regulator to tell them what to do, they're just going to get left behind. There's no question about it. I'll give you one example. When I was at the Treasury Department again, we issued guidance with all of the banking regulators that basically said if you want to for anti-money laundering solutions, if you want to test AI or machine learning ways of doing anti-money laundering, you can do that. And we said you could do it in a pilot, see whether or not it works. If it's wildly successful, we're not going to ding the rest of your program because this pilot was more successful than the other part of your program. If it's a total mess, we're not going to ding you on that experimentation either. And the idea was to incentivize banks to test, innovate, because what we knew on AML is there's a ton of waste in the system. Banks spend a tremendous amount of time on things that don't matter actually in terms of actually fighting financial crimes because of all kinds of regulatory requirements. So we wanted to get past that. When we did that, all the C-suites, everybody was super excited at the banks. A couple of years later, after I left Treasury, I spoke at a West Coast AML forum. And I said, how many of you remember the guidance that we issued? And everyone raised their hand, just about everybody. And then I said, how many of you used it? Not a single hand stayed up. What does that tell you about banking, about the ability or the willingness to test solutions in potential, large institutions? I'm not saying banks aren't innovating. They are all of the time. But if you have a bank versus a fintech, the ability of the fintech to innovate, experiment much more quickly, then I think you'll see who the winners. Or if you have a bank that's willing to experiment much more quickly with this technology, I think that will end up. It's a good predictor of who the winners will be.
Got it.
Down.
I do think, though, in fairness to the banks, which, I think AML and KYC is just a huge waste of time. I mean, it's just so cumbersome. But in fairness to the banks...
That was the point. We were trying to enable them to be much more efficient.
But in fairness to the banks, unless the regulators give them a stamp of approval that this methodology is sufficient and they're not going to get fined, then the banks never want to really, they'll try things, but then they never just broadly adopt, right? The regulators need to say, okay, this...
I completely agree.
Yeah.
It has to be a big give and take.
Yeah.
My point is that's what we were signaling.
Yeah. This particular very senior leader that I was talking to, he actually made a statement that, the cost of fines is far more than the cost of developers that you will use to try that thing out, and you rather wait. And so is there, if I were to ask you from a policymaker's perspective, do you see regulatory arbitrage as a problem? And which markets do you think, sectors, I'm not talking countries, but is it financial services, is it healthcare, is it retail, is it e-commerce, that you think is likely to be the one that takes the most advantage of this without worrying about regulations? I'm basically trying to find out, what is your view on regulatory arbitrage? You're likely to lose innovators to maybe jurisdictions which are a little more soft. We've seen this many a times over in different parts of the world, in different sectors. Is that a risk that you see, that innovators will not come to you? Say in Germany or, in EU?
With a focus, let's say, on financial markets, we see it's like two sides of a medal. like the established players, the bank, they know how regulation works. They know how to read through regulation, what to provide, how to deal with this. They maybe lack sometimes this kind of capability to rethink something radically new. And then we have the fintechs who sometimes lack this capability of really read regulation and what it means. And what we already see is like a lot of, let's say, joint forces. And for example, to embrace a real working future, I think we need different kind of those collaboration models. It's still often like, at least it seems so often that like sometimes either the big players come and they pretend, oh, we are the big established players, you don't know nothing about regulation, so listen to us. But I think it needs to be more dialogue, let's say, among same partners, because both bring a value in, and both values are very, very needed in a functioning system. And what we saw in the financial crisis, and also with everything that happened since the Ukraine invasion, is that we have quite robust markets in at least in Europe. That we really have functioning systems. We had a conversation about too big to fail in the last weeks and months, but in general we have very robust markets, and this is also something that is good out of regulation. But then this kind of good things need to be harvested to fit the future. So I wouldn't. It's not an easy question to answer.
So at a panel yesterday about Athena, the deputy governor of the ECB, I thought made some terrific remarks. And she spoke about how what they're requiring at the ECB is for the regulators to use AI, to use generative AI, to understand it, to test it. And I think we need a little bit more of that. I think the problem of regulators not wanting to say yes is a part of, and so banks not wanting to ask, is a function of they're not all playing on the same playing field because they don't have the same knowledge base. And you can't have that knowledge base if you don't actually touch the technology. And that's where you could see some really interesting and exciting public-private partnerships where, again, we have to get away from the us versus them, public versus private mentality, and see the public sector has to see what can they learn from the private sector in terms of how they're innovating, how they can incorporate some of those technologies into how you're doing supervision, et cetera. That's where I think it's those kinds of initiatives that will ultimately get us to a much better place. It's one thing to read, it's a completely other thing to actually experiment.
Sure, you want to make a point?
Yeah, just directly to this, because what we do on a regular basis is to create, let's say, safe rooms and to then invite
sandboxes.
Yeah, not really a it's even smaller than a sandbox. It's really to, let's say, get the people who are going to take the responsibility and decision-making process on all sides together, and let them work on a question together.
Yes.
And this kind of joint experimentation, we did it also with our board. We said, okay, these are large language models. Go and play with it and see what it gets out of you. And it's not to be used in decision-making process yet, but it's a very easy way to get a much better understanding of technology. And I think this is something that is needed everywhere on every layer and every level.
One of the things that often happens, the US has a formal lobbying system where, college graduates come out to be lobbyists, and they potentially participate in updating the knowledge of regulators around various aspects for whatever they're trying to achieve some policy favor on. Asia doesn't have anything like that. In fact, it's considered to be quite a bad word, right? You're influencing, or, whatever may be another word for it. But from a Europe perspective, and, then we look at the US side of it, how do you view lobbying? How do you learn? How do you come up to the curve with all these new technologies?
And personally, I'm totally convinced without lobbying, we would regulate something what has nothing to do with the reality. So that's why I consider lobbying extremely important. Of course, in our society, this is somehow criticized, especially by NGOs, because they're thinking they do not have enough money for it. But if you're looking closely to it, they are funded already with a lot of money, and they're playing still this card. So that's why lobbying is extremely important. And as a politician, we are learning from lobbying where are the problems and what should be regulated differently, because this is technical, not feasible, because we are not the experts from the beginning. We might be an expert in legislation at the end for one subject, but therefore lobbying is extremely important, I would say.
Melissa, what's your perspective on this?
Well, I actually think the U.S. system is legalized graft. So, I mean, I think lobbying depends on the lobbying. I mean, the U.S. is taking it to an absolute extreme, but it criticizes every other country for lobbyists. I think there's lobbying, meaning, trying to put forward private-public partnerships and educating. And I think in the case of Singapore, they've done an amazing job. I mean, they pay their civil employees well. They're well educated. When they don't know something, they educate themselves and they bring in the best of the best to actually learn. So I think it's actually probably one of the more ideal systems around the world. I think from the public sector can't remain isolated and the private sector can't remain isolated, and there's got to be a coming together. The question of money exchanging hands is, I find quite, appalling, as much as it does in certain countries. But I think this idea that the public sector has to get educated and the private sector has to educate, and they have to come together and find a middle ground to move things forward. I mean, the ideal is absolutely right. How it works differently around the world is,
Yeah, I mean, Singapore is probably a role model in that, involving all stakeholders, working groups, consultation papers, participation from industry is absolutely the way they do this on a very active basis. Sigal, you have a comment on lobbying, and is that a way of learning for regulators and policymakers?
I think that there's a lot that happens outside of the technical category of lobbying where the public and private sector come together and learn from each other. And I think that is extraordinarily important. In fact, again, when I was at Treasury, I set up all kinds of new ways for the public and private sector to interact with each other. I had come from the private sector, so I knew how valuable it was to bring that experience into how I thought about regulating in this space. And so, lobbying has a very specific definition under U.S. law, but putting that to the side, you cannot regulate the private sector without having deep, knowledgeable conversations with them about how things actually operate. None of that is corrupt. That's just good governance and good policy. I could tell you the moments when somebody from the private sector came to me and gave me mind-changing ideas because they came with really important data and experience about what they were doing and how they were implementing our rules. That's extraordinarily important. If we didn't have that, we would make the government would make many, many mistakes.
Excellent.
I'd like to add one thing.
Yes.
Accessibility is very important.
Accessibility?
Right? Accessibility. I mean, when you can make an appointment at MAS to go have a discussion and you don't have to wait, 6 months, and their willingness to engage and have that discussion, that's what you want.
Yeah.
And I think it's accessibility and it's willingness to come together and have those discussions and conversations without wanting something immediate. And that's when you get the best of both worlds, when that access is really available to both innovators as well as investors.
Got it. Sigal, you were going to add something to that.
No, I was making notes.
Okay. Do we have a question from the audience? Yes, there is a hand there, and we may have time just for that one.
Hi, my name is Tanvi. I am from Bangalore. I run a policy innovation lab. So we are like engineers and policy people working on these issues, digital public goods and things. My question is really for the two regulators. Something we have understood from our experience in India is you really need tech-based solutions to these challenges of AI, of crypto, and other emerging tech. So, is there any concerted effort on that in Europe to incubate, to develop such solutions?
What I think is, what we have in mind as a legislator is always, if we are using some special way forward of investments and using crypto and so on, that this should not be only accessible for some parts of our population. So therefore, then we need to kind of step in and say how we can secure these in a way that all others might also be part of it and so on. And this then is a kind of a step forward where I would say to generalize everything what we would like to do, with special interest on the interest of the sector then. But I still think it's necessary, and I'm very glad, by the way, that the European Central Bank is creating the Euro online, because we need also a kind of a currency what might be accessible for everyone who is not understanding the other crypto currencies. And that's why, to secure, to be robust, to be accurate, to be cyber secure, and so on. And these are all elements what is coming together in the mind of a legislator, and that's why then we are coming step forward with the regulation, and that's why we sometimes think it's necessary to go one step further.
Okay, I'm going to have to leave it at that. I'm sorry, our time's up. It's flashing red here. So I do apologize, but I wish to thank this very extraordinary panel made up of policymakers and senior capital investors. I hope it's been useful for everyone. Thank you very much for your time.